Hello, hello. You are here for avoiding due diligence headaches, I hope, right? If you're here for something else, you're gonna have to listen to this. So Eddie Gross, as I've already been introduced, in Washington, D.C., I used to be able to say most important city, the most important country in the world, and now I'm just gonna say our office is 2 blocks from the White House, and now I'm nervous. So I'm going to let my esteemed panelists each introduce themselves, so long as they don't sell or talk too long, somebody. Jack, start with you.
Yeah, good. Jack Gilchrist, Gilchrist Aviation Law in Oklahoma City. We do title and registration work in Oklahoma City, escrow transactions.
Bruce Marshall, General Counsel at AIC Title Service. And again, we're in Oklahoma City and we assist in handling aircraft transactions.
Greg Luster, I'm General Counsel for Insured Aircraft Title Service. And again, just like Bruce, we handle escrow and title for aircraft transactions.
I'm David Mayer from Shackelford Law Firm in Dallas. I'm involved in all the stuff that we do from the beginning of an airplane experience.
Thanks, Dave. And gentlemen, 5 lawyers you get to listen to. Oh, boy. And nobody's going to get a bill. So first topic. When does due diligence start in purchase and sale transactions? Let's cue this Slido for this, please. Right? When does due diligence start in purchase and sale transactions? That's the wrong. Yeah, okay, there we go. All right, so there we go. So you see the answers. When the parties hire aircraft broker is 100%. And let's go with the answer then. Let's surprise everybody. The answer is all of the above, right? Perfect. Okay, so that leads us to our discussion. Dave, why don't you start talking about the beginning of due diligence?
Thank you, Eddie. The due diligence process continues to get more complicated and really needs all of us to participate at our inception of a transaction. And for many transactions, that can be the aviation broker or aviation counsel. But that is a kickoff where responsibility that we'll describe begins for each of the players individually and collectively. No amount of material activity in a transaction should happen without that start.
Jack, but it may start then, but it's ongoing, correct?
Yeah, I think it's a question, maybe a question even before that is maybe what is due diligence, right? There's that question's involved, but what's the purpose of it? And I think if we ask that question, answer that question probably better than ask it. But the idea of due diligence in a transaction certainly has to do with there's a what we call the naughty list. There's the blacklist, people that can't do transactions because of the fact that they're on the OFAC list or for some other reason sanctioned. And certainly that's the case. But then I think also there are red flags that come up in the process of really analyzing the parties that are wanting to do a transaction. And that has to start with each phase, even as brokers and dealers take on the possibility of a buyer or even they should know at that point. They should begin to question, to analyze, to investigate. So I think what is it we want to know? Is it just whether we can hold money in escrow, or is it because we don't think we should be doing business with these people, right? In that sense.
Well, and transactions are dynamic, right? Yeah. You may start with a set of what you think are, the essential facts, but as time goes by, and I found especially with business aviation matters, right, that you start peeling back the layers of the onion, right? So, all right, let's go to the next question. Who has responsibility for conducting due diligence in aircraft purchases, sale transactions, right? So this is the who. Oh, I wish. It's my favorite group. But the Slido question for that, please. right? So let's see, A's getting a lot of love. Okay, well, let's go with the answer then. And the answer is C, right? So a lot of folks. Greg, start talking about the process and about, all the different people who are involved in that due diligence process.
Yeah, just like the answer shows, it's everyone's responsibility to be involved in the due diligence process. It starts with the brokers, obviously the bank, the escrow agents, the buyers and sellers have to do their own because, the consequences of not doing due diligence, can be, rather hefty. And so it's essential for everyone to do it. Yeah, we're all in it together.
Bruce, what's your perspective?
Well, I would have to agree with Greg, and I think it's very important because each party brings to the table certain information pertaining to the transaction. Sometimes the brokers and the aviation attorneys or consultants have access to more information about the parties and who's really involved in the transaction than sometimes the escrow agents or the lenders. And so having them being part of that process really can facilitate getting the information out there to everyone in the transaction.
Yeah, I think too that the idea here, I've said it before, but everybody in this industry, and even particularly if you look at Oklahoma City folks, between the title companies and the law firms, I know for certain that each of us is interested in protecting one another in this field. There's no benefit from a deal gone bad because of a lack of due diligence, let's say, or a mal player, somebody in the process, and we're regularly and constantly under attack. We can talk about that some too. It's something that's it's a focus of the mal players out there, and there's safety in numbers, right? And I think that's true in even answering this question. The idea is that everybody looking at the equation should be considering that. I had an example from this past week where we had some questions about a player in a transaction that came up through our due diligence, and it happened to be a trustor, a non-citizen beneficiary under a trust. And so we turned to the trust company to ask questions. What do they know? Have they vetted the information enough? Are they satisfied? I care about the trustees at the same time, right? And I think certainly they care about us in the process. So that's true, and true for these guys. If they've turned down a deal because they have some questions, it's not so much that we might share confidential information that we're supposed to have been keeping confidential, but if we have some concerns, it might be something like, you should look carefully, right? You should look carefully, or whatever the case is. Or if I know one of these guys turned it down, or David, or you, anybody else, I'd say, I'm going to look carefully at it to see what the issues were for sure.
I mean, it's a tight group, like us folks in the industry, right? And so collaborative approaches to things have worked for a long time, and that's really the best approach.
And to put some meat on that bone, or to give some color, what I think we're suggesting is that the due diligence process in a transaction is not binary. It's a unified effort that's going to have to occur around the whole table. We have negotiations. We presumably do that in an appropriate way. But if some part of the transaction is not right, all of us around the table and our clients and people who are in the chain of thought and funds need to work together to make sure that we don't invite one of the many national or international agencies into our world. And here's the consequence. We can say, look, that's your client, that's your problem, we don't care. If that person is from Russian origin, related to an oligarch, that's your problem. What I don't know won't hurt me. That's simply not true. Even if you have no blame or responsibility, ask yourself how much it's going to cost to get FinCEN, the Treasury, out of your life when they come after you, or justice. So you don't want to deal with these people, and that's why collectively we have to work together no matter how we otherwise negotiate in the transactions.
Yeah, equally true, I think, important, I think you would agree maybe, David, that assuming that somebody else has done it, that's also dangerous. That is, if we assume, if players participating in a transaction assume that the escrow agents are going to do the due diligence, they're going to vet the people, or they vetted everybody, and you understand that it's not, if you've looked at a request for due diligence information, it's not just the parties, seller A and buyer B. It's who are behind the parties, who make up the parties. We have to know all of that information. So there's a lot of information to sort of dig through. It's not a simple process.
Well, let me,
Well, and just on another note, it's my understanding from conversations with these law enforcement agencies that it's not enough just to do your due diligence. You have to document it. Because if they come and you can't show searches or anything like that, then their assumption is you didn't do it.
so you have to do your own homework and you have to be able to show your work.
Show your work.
So let's go to the next question. We've so far covered the when and the who. This is the what and the why, right? So what are some of the essential considerations regarding the due diligence process, including what and why? Right, so the next slide-o regarding corporate transparency. Okay, let's go with the answer.
Eddie, I'll give you a hand on that one. The Corporate Transparency Act, as you know, took full force this year. It was passed in 2022. On January 1, it started requiring the reporting by beneficial owners, that's the term of art, of certain what I'll call personal information like home address, identification, licenses, and so forth. It's different for individuals and for companies. But in the main, what is happening is reporting to the Financial Crimes Network Division of Treasury enough information that they can use all of their intelligence to find bad guys. And the bad guys they describe as someone involved in criminal activity, including money laundering, including terrorism support, or even moving drugs. All of those things are targets for them, and they have considerable powers to enforce both civil and criminal penalties. So it's nothing to mess with. Just
Dave?
A heads up on that time-wise, this year is a compliance year. So we're talking small companies, LLCs. Remember, this is a compliance year, and non-compliance will be problematic for Treasury.
Thanks, Dave. Anyway, Greg, do you want to tell us what your checklist is and why those things are in your checklist?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing we're trying to do is just get to the ultimate beneficial owner. You know, I mean, people want to supply their sheet, their KYC sheet, or use ours. It really doesn't matter, because ultimately we need to know who the individual is who owns the company. And, you know, that's the whole purpose. That's the why we do it, is that's what we have to know. And, you know, in those instances, there's three, you know, from our standpoint, there's three ways to get to a no. The first is non-disclosure, just refusing to provide due diligence information. The second is an OFAC hit, or, you know, some legal issue which precludes the transaction. And the third issue is reputational risk. Is this person or this entity someone we want to do business with? You know, and all three of those things are important.
So, go ahead, Bruce. You were gonna talk, but what I'm looking for also is like the particular laws that you're trying to, you know, comply with, right? And so we've mentioned some of them, but, you know, what haven't we mentioned? even though the information might have an overlapping purpose, right? It's, there are a couple of things that we need to be able to be aware of, and that's why we're asking the questions.
Eddie, each of us subscribes to a third-party, restricted party screening process, whether it's WorldCheck, LexisNexis, there are other ones that are out there and available to do the screening of the parties in transactions. And it's very critical that we're able to identify that information and who those parties are. And to some extent, it falls into a couple buckets in terms of ownership of the aircraft and the money that's going to be involved in the transaction. But when we're talking ownership of the aircraft, it involves knowing who actually is the owner today, who's going to benefit from this sale transaction, and on the other side of it, who's going to wind up with the aircraft, who's going to own it, and we need to know that as well as the source of the funding for the transaction, because as we mentioned before, everybody along the chain of the transaction that's going to touch or be in control of the funds in the transaction, whether they're just a recipient of some of the proceeds, they need to be doing their due diligence because they could be subject to one of these agencies. And I think you were mentioning that we have OFAC in the U.S., the Office of Foreign Assets Control, but there are counterparts, and most of us are working on an international basis. There are counterparts in different countries, as well as when we subscribe to these services, there are over hundreds of different databases and information that are included in that really can tell us, are we really dealing with bad guys and their conduct throughout the world?
Sometimes, though, too, it's difficult to tell. You have to sift through a lot of information, certainly, and even it's not just a matter of checking lists, but whether somebody's name is on a list, right? It could be a simple Google search or whatever, and I think that's part of it. But also, too, somebody could be in trouble with an international government, with their home government in some way that's maybe politically motivated. You could have all kinds of. It's not really always black and white. It's often can be a gray area. But then it's, as Greg mentioned, it's reputational risk, right? It is. Are we okay with doing business with this person at the end of the day? I think too. Interesting question.
Do you often have to explain the why to the various information, sources?
Yeah, you're going to have to, if you come up with a no at some level, you're going to have to explain why, right? At some level, you're going to have to explain why. And then the question is, how far does that obligation go, right, in the process? Yeah. We got some good questions, but from the audience.
We'll get there.
Hey, it's your show, Eddie. I'm not.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I'm just sitting here.
We'll get to those. Let me just keep going through where we are. So, what are the transaction considerations that have not determined up front could be deal wreckers? The way we refer to this is surprises suck the momentum out of a deal. Pretty good, right? So let's have the Slido question for that. Oh, there is none. All right, so instead, let's start with Bruce. He's kind of like Slido.
Okay. One of the key things that we were here to talk about the headaches of due diligence and how to avoid those headaches. And when we get information that hasn't been disclosed, or we learn this information late in the transaction, particularly if the parties have done everything they need to do and they want to close tomorrow, yet they bring to the table some parties that we didn't know about, that are now being introduced into the transaction, or sources of funding on it that we haven't had time to do our homework on and vet this out, or we haven't had the cooperation of some of the parties. I think Jack mentioned that earlier, that sometimes you end up with parties that are unwilling to share the information that we need to be able to confirm, are you the person that showed up on our hit in our search, or was that somebody else? Unless you supply us with certain information, we're not going to be able to come to that conclusion, and we might have to either delay or withdraw from the transaction, which isn't something I don't think anyone wants in our industry. We like to get things done quickly and efficiently.
And to put a little color on that, so that you understand our perspective, the legal team is hopefully always there to help get transactions done cleanly and quickly. And I think what Bruce is saying is you put yourself and your team in the transaction in an awkward position if we don't know up front all the material parts of the deal, structure, and players. And just so you understand, if you're doing cross-border and there are new lawyers or brokers or other players involved, and you don't know those players from doing transactions previously, they are part of your investigation. And a good way to think of this is be suspicious from the start where you don't have firm knowledge that you've validated.
What are some examples of things that trickle in, during the course of, from where you start to where you hope to end, that are the most annoying, I'll just say, right? The ones that are most problematic.
Well, I think it's when we receive new sources of funding at last minute. If we've received a remitter of funds, we know where they're supposed to be coming from, and then suddenly there are multiple parties that may be providing the funds for the transaction or another party taking some interest in the aircraft, then we have to question. That's one of the red flag areas that can cause a lot of difficulty for us.
Yeah, and in my example earlier, a trustor, a non-citizen trustor, really that they made a change. The 11th hour closing is set for tomorrow, and we've got it was actually tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. We've got a new party, a new trustee, and a new trustor that came in suddenly that's actually going to become the owner of the aircraft. That's a red flag, first of all. I mean, at least it's a yellow flag. You're going to have to look into all that too, but it usually unfolds one piece at a time. But at the end of the day too, look, the system, there's not a perfect system because of the fact that you're really relying on the party themselves to say who owns you, right? Give us a list of who are the players here. And in some cases, if it's a public company, I mean, that kind of thing's easier. Or if it's something we can check in the U.S. on state records, we do that. But you can easily make some of this stuff up. And so that's why we say it takes everybody. If somebody says, I don't know who these people are that claim to be my buyer, I think that gets to be a hurdle that's really almost something you can't cross. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I think another one of the last minute things that causes headaches are the undisclosed or non-disclosed or late disclosed back-to-back transactions. And unfortunately, this does happen from time to time in our industry. We suddenly become aware that there's more than just a buyer and a seller. There's a buyer, a middle guy, and then another end buyer in the transaction. And again, at last minute, having to vet all these parties and make sure that we can work with the parties, especially with the front end being all negotiated and ready to go. And then we find out on the back end they brought someone to the table, either a source of funding or a party that we can't work with. And that happens occasionally. Not often, but occasionally it does.
So Jack, you'll answer that question at the outset, right? Are there series of transactions, right?
Yeah, we're going to have to ask it early. That's true, but there could be times too when you ask it early and it's not clear that things change along the way, that it becomes a back-to-back. Now we're not doing a back-to-back. We're just selling it to somebody in the middle, and then it's going on to the end guy. Well, that's what we call a back-to-back. But I think. So it can be difficult to actually extract that information from the parties. But again, as we play together, our interest is mutual, and that is to keep the bad players out. It's not good for anybody in the industry, and move on to the next possible buyer or whatever your options are in the situation. So.
Yeah, I actually have a real-world example of where we ended up with a situation. I was involved with Jack on this one, where his firm was handling the front end of the transaction. Everybody knew it was going to be, sold to another party. We were on the back end of the transaction, working with the buyer on a back-to-back on the end buyer, and we suddenly find out it was actually the broker that Jack was working with had learned that our end buyer we were representing had planned, they weren't just going to be holding the aircraft for their own inventory and eventually selling it. There was a simultaneous transaction where it was going to a third party end buyer on a third back-to-back. And when we did our homework and we were alerted by Jack's broker that this was going to happen, when we did our homework on this, we realized that none of us wanted to be involved in that transaction, because I think the ultimate end buyer on this back-to-back-to-back was a party that had been convicted of, I think it was human trafficking. So
Obviously.
walked away from it.
Greg, you wanted to weigh in.
Oh, I just wanted
And I
to
said
add-
Jack's name instead of yours first, so sorry about that.
I just wanted to add one thing. It's last minute payees as well. If you all, bring a broker in at the last minute, or if, I can't tell if that's me or not, broker, or even, paying the fuel company or the MRO, we still have to do diligence on everyone who receives funds. So if we could get that information timely too, it helps smooth closing.
How about where the aircraft might be operated or hangared, if they change that information?
We'll
I mean,
definitely.
registration, you'll know, but those other things that could be,
Well, I mean, if it's
that
a
could change.
country that's facing blocking sanctions, I mean, obviously that's an issue. There's other countries that, we have heightened scrutiny for, and, that could cause a disruption.
Okay,
To
let's
the
go to.
basic, if I may, Eddie, to
Dave,
just tack
Dave,
on.
let's go to the next one if it's okay. You can bring that up afterwards. So due diligence red flags, what are they and what do we do about them? There's a Slido question for that, right? So far nobody's voting. Okay, well, I'm not seeing anything. All right, so let's, there we go. All of the above. Very good. And that's the answer. So let's talk about it. Jack, start that conversation about red flags, and then, the very interesting question of what do we do about it when we find that there's a red flag?
Yeah, I think there are certain signs, certainly there are red flags. I mean, red flags meaning, if we're saying red flags meaning we got to put the brakes on, I think maybe you could say there are flags that you run into that are cautions along the way that you say we've got to look at more of this too. But certainly if somebody's falls into a sanction, they fall into the category of a sanction, that's possible that's certainly going to be a red flag. Somebody whose name's on OFAC's list. It's interesting too, though, because the OFAC list really doesn't, it's interesting it's more interesting who's not on the OFAC list than who is on the OFAC list, I think, in some ways. Eddie's
Am I
name,
on that?
Eddie's name, for
Yeah,
instance,
right,
no,
right.
we won't talk about that. But I think it's not as easy as simply checking the list if somebody's name's on it or not on it, because there is this idea of doing searches. I think one of the questions from the audience had to do with, do you do sort of a social media background sort of check? Do you see what's on the internet, what's available in general news? And we do that.
If it's about me, don't believe it. It's not true.
It's a lot of false stuff written out there. But we do that, and it gives us. I always envision myself in sort of sitting in the witness seat in a trial, right? And how do I want to answer the question of did you not run a Google search on this guy, right? I don't want to answer that question unless it's yes, we did and we were satisfied with what we found or whatever, or what we didn't find. But all of that information gathers together pieces that we want to vet out all the way to the end until we're satisfied. And so there can be negative information, certainly anything to do with fraud, money laundering, that kind of thing. Those begin to be red flags. Now, sometimes it could be somebody that had been convicted in the past, and everybody knows that, and he's done time, or he or she's done time, or whatever the case is. So you have to vet that out. Does everybody know who they're dealing with here? That's important too. And that's to answer the question of what do you do with the information? And I think there are certain people in the transaction that need to know what's out there, what information you found. And in that sense, sometimes it's necessary to share that we won't do business in this deal for a certain reason, but at that point we feel necessary in some cases to certainly to share at least what we found as far as that goes. We have to be cautious about that, though.
Greg, is there some anxiety that you have when you find a red flag, and like, what do you do about it? And do you feel like maybe I shouldn't, or
Well,
maybe
I
I
mean-
have to?
I always tell my staff that KYC is an art, not a science, because we really, there's a lot of judgment calls that are made. But no, any red flag, it starts to, starts to increase your inspection of the deal. I mean, if there's one, there's bound to be others. And the most difficult of all is the reputational risk. I mean, an OFAC hit's easy. The answer is no. But then you get, if someone's been charged with falsifying aircraft records, and they're out, they've done their time, you have to make a decision. Is that, somebody from our standpoint that our company or our bank, wants to be involved with? And that's part of the process.
So to put together a list of who you have to report that information to versus who you might provide that information to, and then who you shouldn't provide that information
We
to.
have a current example of that. We received funds from an entity, and then 4 days later, they get put on the OFAC list. So, the decision is, what do we do with the money? I mean, we can't give it back to them. It's not ours. So, luckily, we have to file a report to OFAC, and then they're probably either going to seize the money or leave it there. So, it just happens.
But if you take the consequence of what we're talking about here, you've now expanded the potential consequences to folks who do what we do and what you do, saying, we can't stay in this transaction. So you have not only regulatory authorities who take an interest in it because of the reputational, economic, and company risk. That means that professionals may have to step out of the transaction, which of course is in nobody's best interest. That's why if we know structure early and we're all involved, and I think our desire would be to exchange information among the folks who are doing diligence, we're all better off because then we have a shot at closing smoothly and being able to document and explain to a regulatory authority if questions come up without engaging in a really difficult consequence with the government.
Suppose what you have is a hunch as a red flag, right? You feel like the information that you've uncovered makes you nervous about a particular aspect of a deal, a particular person. What do you do about that?
Great question, because I'm afraid that occurs a lot more than we'd like. What I would propose is that we have many useful tools for doing the diligence among folks on the panel, and in particular, banks have some very high-quality tools for doing the investigation, and I think that it's incumbent upon us to find a way, subject to appropriate confidentiality, to share that concern, call it a yellow flag, to immediately investigate and hopefully terminate the problem, or if it is a problem, to restructure. So that comes up a lot, Eddie.
Where I'm going with that really is, like, I'd be nervous about sharing that information with, with whoever else is on the deal, certain of them, none of them. Greg, what do you think?
Well, in instances like that, if it's a reputational risk, we don't really give a reason. I'll send an email to the parties and say, unfortunately, IATS is unable to proceed for business reasons. And because I don't want to defame anyone. And, the situation can come up too, where we have a hit. This happened to me. We had a hit, same name. The guy swears he's not the terrorist, and I can't clear him because there's no birthday, there's no anything. So we had to decline the deal. And, obviously he's upset because he thinks we're, impugning his character. And I just, that's why I just stick to, for business reasons, we're declining the transaction.
And Eddie, you're absolutely right. That risk is
Right.
extremely important.
Bruce, what do you think?
I think one of those gray areas is that our social media searches sometimes give us a heads up on the people that are going to be next on the OFAC list and other sanction lists. Just because of the information, what they're engaged in, for, the charges that may be out there. They may not be convicted yet, but they're under investigation. And sometimes those investigations aren't going to be disclosed, particularly in the U.S. We're not going to know about it until suddenly they appear on the list. And those are some of the ones that we have a very hard time of a decision. Do we stay in this deal or do we get out of this deal knowing that it's very potential it's going to be a problem for us?
Jack, it's not is not using an escrow a red flag?
Yeah, I saw the question. I think it's an interesting one. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a red flag in and of itself. There's certainly transactions where you don't need to escrow, if you're talking about escrowing funds. But again, going back to sort of our original question here is whose responsibility is it? Everybody, regardless of whether funds are flowing through Oklahoma City or someplace else or directly to the parties, still the due diligence is there, right? Because you've got a transaction. Somebody asked the question about spare parts. Should we use due diligence in spare parts? And the answer is yes. It doesn't matter if they're spare parts, spare automobile parts or whatever. I think you still have the challenge of due diligence in that process and knowing who the parties are, who's selling, who's buying, where's the money coming from, and where's it going. It's those questions.
Bruce, you mentioned before about identifying source of funds, right? And so talk about that. Talk about what you do, what you have to do, what you try to do to be sure you're certain of the source of funds.
Well, again, we're going to be running through our restricted party screening software any individual or company that's remitting funds to us. Now, when we're dealing with entities and organizations, that's where we have to do a little deeper dive. And then the question is how deep do we need to dive? And that some of that comes under some of the Corporate Transparency Act regulations, things that sort of set some of the guidelines and numbers. And maybe some of the other panelists can let us know what their position, but typically 25% ownership of someone that may be on the sanctions list, or they're a designated party that may be, putting everyone at risk, their ownership, diving down and finding that sometimes in transactions can be very difficult.
Okay.
So if ultimately they're the source of the funds, then we need to pull out.
Perfect. So let's see if we can cover these rest of the questions in the little bit of time we have left. How does due diligence change when the transaction is for spare parts versus the whole aircraft?
I don't think it changes. That's kind of what I was getting at. It doesn't, technically it shouldn't change because the question's still there. There's no special aspect of it.
It's metal, right? They're both metal and there's money involved.
Same issue. I think the other one here that's interesting is how far does a seller's lender have to go to conduct a due diligence of a buyer when the lender's only providing a lien release once the loan is fully paid off? It's the fully paid off, it becomes the question. It's who are you getting money from, right? And at some level that has to have been vetted to the satisfaction of the parties. Where's the money coming from? Because if it's a bad player, bad actor in the process, then it's a red flag.
Do we have time for one more question? I saw one that was kind of interesting that my panel might or might not want to respond to. Any lessons learned from Wright Brothers fallout?
Know who you're doing business with.
I mean, will somebody synopsize in 30 seconds what that's about?
Well, I think one of the key things is not giving lip service to what we've been talking about today, the due diligence process. That was one of the issues that sort of triggered the whole investigation by the Attorney General's office of the activities of the trust company that was involved in that.
Essentially, everybody loses, right? So that's the thing. That's the best lesson to learn.
Yeah.
We're good? Thank you. Thanks, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie.